Welcome to CivilNet. In our continuing effort to try to understand the conflict in Syria and its implications for not just the Syrians, but everyone living in the region, this morning we're going to speak with Jihad Yazigi, who is editor of the Syria Report. And these days, Jihad is in Beirut. Jihad, thank you for speaking with us.
Thanks to you.
And tell me why you're in Beirut and not in Damascus or Aleppo. I assume that's where you were.
Absolutely. I was based in Damascus actually until last June. But because of the increasing violence and in order to avoid, if you want to take less risks, I decided to move to Beirut. I have kids, and kids need to be schooled, obviously. And although people continue to live in Damascus, I felt it's safer for the long term to be based here, for this year at least.
Does it make your job harder or easier to be in Beirut?
Obviously, it makes it harder in terms of capacity to talk to people and meet people and collect information and understand how the economy is changing. But at the same time, by being here, you have some distance. You have much less to worry about your own security, about fearing for your children. Whenever you hear the sound of bombs or bullets, you get anxious and you get impatient with your kids. You want them back home. So you have much less tension and much less stress here. So it has its good and bad sides at the same time.
You have been writing about the Syrian conflict in the context of its economic roots and its economic implications. I mean, you've made clear, I guess, what anybody should figure out, that when people are crying for freedom and dignity, usually at the base of that is jobs and growth and just financial daily security. Is that something that is being talked about within the conflict itself today, the government side, the opposition side? Is that even a subject on the table, today's economic situation and tomorrow's?
No, not much. To be honest, what is being discussed today most is obviously the increase in the level of violence, which is really, if you want, I mean, it is such a major concern for everyone that people have little time in Damascus itself or across the country to try to understand what the origins of this conflict were. Of course, you have a lot of people writing on these matters. And of course, if you want, among the urban elite and the intellectuals, the issues related to freedom, to the freedom of speech and of expression are being put at the forefront. And they are quite clearly a major part of the reason why people, revolted and took to the streets. Now, when you talk about dignity, for instance, dignity does involve, your income. I mean,
your daily bread.
Absolutely. I mean, the capacity, how the amount of money you have to ensure your family, to provide the basic needs for your family, plays a role in how you feel in terms of your dignity, even in certain sense, your freedom, if you want. It's freedom to move, to choose where to work and how to work, and so on and so forth. So it's really a mix of issues here. It's quite obvious if you look at the geography of the uprising, that the areas that are, really protesting most are areas where people have the least to lose, which is a bit common, a bit everywhere. It's not the people who have big assets that are going to take to the streets.
The other thing that you have explained in your writings is that the geography of the conflict shows that the conflict erupted in places where the Ba'ath Party had its greatest support. Does that mean A, they took it for granted, or B, they gave them enough resources that they could rise to a point of protest?
No, you know what really happened in Syria was a generational change among the ruling elite. I mean, the people who are today governing Syria are people who were brought up in the cities. Contrary, for instance, to the previous generation, Hafez al-Assad, the previous president, called himself a peasant. It is no more the case today of the people that are governing. What has happened is that you have a contraction of state services, a divestment of the state from the rural areas, from the economy as a whole, and from the rural areas in particular. You have had an increase in the services industry, and actually in the last few years in Syria, you had the growth in GDP because you had a lot of banks, hotels and so on opening. But at the same time, the agricultural areas, for instance, have been very seriously affected by the drought, by the mismanagement, by the divestment from the state. Let me give you a short example. In 2003, agriculture represented 25% of GDP. Less than 7 years later, in 2010, it represented only 16%. So it fell from 25 to 16 in less than 7 years. That is dramatic in terms of shift.
And it's dramatic for a country like Syria that is so known for its both internal agricultural market and its ability to export. Given the fact that everybody, pundits, and I assume the powers on the ground, are now looking at this as a stretched out conflict, a conflict that's going to take time to resolve, are the sides, especially the opposition in this case, the rebels, are they looking for ways to help economically sustain their support base in order for that support base to continue to believe in them and trust in them and want them to turn into the next rulers? This is a difficult thing to do in the midst of a conflict.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, because of the levels of violence, I mean, the country is in practice divided in various areas. You have the Kurdish northeast, which is calm, but which has little government presence. The west, which is calm, has strong government protest. Aleppo, which is under bombardment. You know, so in practice, what is happening is the whole rural areas of the northwest that are no more under government control. So in terms of the economy, each of these areas is actually trying to manage itself. In some areas, you have government services. When there aren't government services, the rebels have to provide for the population. You have had situations where the people have revolted and demonstrated against the rebels because they felt that the rebels misbehaved with them.
Tell us more about that. That's something we don't hear.
Yes, well, it did happen, if I recall well, maybe once in Aleppo and also sometimes in some of the areas northwest. I'm not there myself, but these are reports that have been published. People that have been upset by the fact that, you know, the demise of the state in these areas has led to some forms of chaos, and people have obviously, you know, tried to take benefit of that. And you know, the Free Syrian Army, it's not really an army. So you have in some areas a group of people who call themselves Free Syrian Army and try to rule this area as they wish. And so you have had a conflict, you know, between them and the population. So it is a pretty complicated and chaotic situation in large parts of the country.
We're calling this the Syrian civil war. Civil war kind of implies two sides. Are there two sides in this conflict, or are there lots of sides?
Well, it certainly did not begin as a civil war. And even today, calling it civil war is a bit cumbersome, really. We cannot deny, though, that today the population society is polarized, that the people who are supporting the regime remain a sizable number. So it doesn't mean there isn't really a war in the sense that the other side, the rebels, are not really, if you want, you don't have competing agendas in terms of the future of Syria. The Alawites are not calling for an independent state. The rebels are not calling for an Islamist state. Even if you may find some of the rebels that do so, none of the major opposition groups has called for a state which would be rejecting people from the minorities. So you are not really in a situation where people have different scenario as how to the future of Syria will be built. But we cannot deny that society is extremely polarized, and parts of it feels protected by the regime and another feels protected by the rebels. So I'm not sure if it fits into a proper definition of civil war, but it is certainly, before anything else, a popular uprising that has partly turned violent. Maybe that's the best way of describing it.
One last question, Turkey's role. Is it a political role, or is it just a political and human rights engagement, or is it fair to say that this is as much an economic engagement both for the present and the future?
No, I don't think here that for Turkey, the economy as such plays a major role in terms of how it views the conflict in Syria. It is quite obvious that the development of the economy has been a major factor in the development of Turkey's regional role. But what one has to say is that Turkey has lost tremendously from the conflict with Syria and from the disruption in trade ties. Turkey largely benefited from the free trade agreement signed with Syria, and it lost much more than Syria did because it benefited most from this free trade agreement. So I do think it's largely a political issue. Of course, I mean, we know the history of Turkey in that region. We know the history of the relation with the Kurdish minority, for instance. So I think it is largely centered on political priorities rather than economic ones.
And the Syrian population sees it that way, perceives Turkey's engagement that way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are worries. If you want, one good thing in what is happening is that the international community, including Turkey, has been such a, has behaved in such a bad way towards the population. I mean, Erdogan has been saying one thing and doing the opposite for such a long time. The same applies to the Americans and to Western countries in general. Of course, most people are also very disappointed by what the Iranians did. So if you want, there is in general a rejection of anything that is really coming from abroad. At the end of the day, of course, I mean, the country that will support the winning side will have a more important influence in the future. But I think what the conflict has created is a deep suspicion towards foreign involvement in the country. It already existed before, but it has been reinforced now.
We've been speaking with Jihad Yazigi, who is editor of the Syria Report, about the multifaceted concerns about the conflict in Syria, both today and tomorrow. Jihad, thank you for giving us time, and I hope you'll give us time again in the future.
Certainly. Thank you a lot.
Thank you for watching CivilNet.